From New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States, this is Democracy Now!
Hello, my name is Brooke Williams, George Floyd's niece, and I can breathe. As long as I'm breathing, justice will be served.
As protests against police brutality and racism continue across the country, George Floyd is laid to rest in Houston. We'll hear excerpts from his funeral. Then we speak to Harvard professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad, author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America.
In streets across America, hundreds of thousands of protesters right now are showing us exactly what transformation looks like. There hasn't been a moment since the 1960s, and maybe even going back to the early 20th century, when we saw labor upheavals and a fundamental challenge to capitalism that creates the kind of opportunity we want right now to see real and lasting change in this country.
And we look at the story of Martin Gugino, the 75-year-old Buffalo peace activist who remains hospitalized after being pushed to the ground by two Buffalo police officers. On Tuesday, President Trump attacked him on Twitter, claiming he staged his own fall and was an Antifa provocateur. We'll speak with a member of the Peace Poets who protests alongside Martin Gugino for over a decade with Witness Against Torture. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. After weeks of protests over the death of George Floyd, who died after a Minneapolis police officer killed him by kneeling on his neck for nearly 9 minutes, family and friends gathered in Houston Tuesday for a private funeral to lay George Floyd to rest and to call for change. This is Brooke Williams, George Floyd's niece, speaking at the funeral.
These laws need to be changed. No more hate crimes, please. Someone said, make America great again. But when has America ever been great? Those 4 officers were literally on him for 9 minutes, and none of them showed they have a heart or soul. This is not just murder, but a hate crime. I share happy memories with my uncle. Now that's all I have, are memories.
After the funeral, George Floyd's golden coffin was driven to a cemetery to be buried beside his mother. Thousands lined the streets as his motorcade passed. The last mile, his coffin was carried in a horse-drawn carriage. After headlines, we'll air excerpts from George Floyd's funeral service, including remarks by his brother, Philonis, who's testifying today before the House Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C. Coronavirus cases are continuing to soar across the United States as the death toll tops 112,000. The Washington Post reports COVID-19 hospitalizations are increasing in at least 9 states following the reopening of businesses. Texas, North and South Carolina, California, Oregon, Arkansas, Mississippi, Utah, and Arizona are all seeing a surge in patients needing medical attention. Texas has seen 2 consecutive days of record coronavirus hospitalizations. On Tuesday, the nation's top infectious disease doctor, Anthony Fauci, described coronavirus as his, quote, worst nightmare and said the pandemic is not close to over yet. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation has revised its projected U.S. death toll upwards, predicting 145,000 deaths by early August. Voters headed to the polls in 5 states Tuesday. In Georgia, some voters had to wait in line for as long as 5 hours in the heat and rain due to widespread problems with new electronic voting machines and a shortage of trained poll workers. Georgia's Republican Secretary of State has launched a probe. Former gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams said, quote, it's a disaster that was imminently preventable. We found ourselves in the mix of both incompetence and malfeasance. The New York Times has published drone footage showing hundreds of people waiting in line at one site. The lines were so long, Judges extended voting hours at polls in at least 20 counties, including in areas with large African-American communities. Reporters from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution posted videos of voters complaining about the long lines. This is 80-year-old Anita Hurd.
Ridiculous. In the United States of America, this time, people can vote. People are killing each other. I can't get along. I don't have to like you, but I respect you as a human being. What is going on? And now we get here. People have been, look at these people. We've been waiting. We've been waiting since 6 o'clock this morning. 6 o'clock. If you go around this building, you'll see people waiting in line. This is unfair.
DeKalb County Commissioner Merida Davis Johnson said, quote, "If this is a preview of November, then we're in trouble." Unquote. Georgia's closed over 200 polling places since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013. Results from the Georgia election won't be finalized for days. John Ossoff is leading in the Democratic Senate primary, but a runoff may still be needed to decide who will challenge Republican Senator David Perdue in November. In other election news, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham survived a challenge from 3 fellow Republicans in South Carolina. He'll face Democrat Jamie Harrison in November. Protests against racism and police brutality continue to rock cities and towns across the United States and around the world. In Richmond, Virginia, protesters toppled a statue of Christopher Columbus on Tuesday evening. They set it on fire before throwing it in a nearby lake. In Antwerp, Belgium, city officials removed a statue of King Leopold II Tuesday, just days after protesters set it on fire. From 1885 to 1908, Leopold declared himself absolute ruler of Congo, leading a campaign of torture and genocide that killed an estimated 10 million people. In England, authorities have removed a statue of 18th century Scottish Lord Robert Milligan from outside the Museum of London Docklands after protesters covered it in a tarp and a Black Lives Matter sign. Milligan enslaved over 500 people on his family's sugar plantations in Jamaica. The statue's removal was welcomed by City Councillor Amina Ali.
It's a victory, and for the ancestors and the people whose lives have been affected by slavery, this is a victory today. So it's very symbolic, and I'm glad it's happened in my lifetime.
Washington State, hundreds of Black Lives Matter protesters took over Seattle City Hall Tuesday evening, demanding the defunding of the Seattle Police Department and the resignation of Mayor Jenny Durkan. Police did not try to stop the protesters as they marched downtown, unlike on previous nights when officers unloaded with a barrage of so-called less lethal firepower. On Monday, Seattle City Council member Teresa Mosqueda condemned the mayor's militarized response to protests.
How many people need to write in about being gassed in their own homes? How many people have to be sprayed in the street every night or experience getting hit with flash bombs or rubber bullets? How many people have to call for the police to be defunded, for you to consider resigning, or for the mayor to embrace radical change?
Here in New York, state lawmakers have voted to ban the use of police chokeholds and to repeal a controversial law known as 50A that shields the disciplinary records of police officers from the public. The vote came despite heavy lobbying from police unions to keep officers' records secret. In Phoenix, Arizona, hundreds of protesters have taken to the streets demanding justice for 28-year-old Deon Johnson, who was killed by a police officer on the same day George Floyd was killed in Minnesota. On May 25th, Johnson was allegedly sleeping in his car on the side of a North Phoenix highway when a Department of Public Safety trooper shot him, alleging he feared he would be pushed into oncoming traffic. Johnson's family is demanding the release of the name of the trooper, the official report of the incident, and any video footage that may exist. The trooper was reportedly not wearing a body camera, did not have a dashboard camera, and there were no known witnesses. Johnson's family's called on the U.S. Justice Department to investigate and for the trooper to be arrested and charged. In Minneapolis, police have admitted officers slashed the tires of unoccupied vehicles parked near recent protests over the killing of George Floyd after Mother Jones magazine published photos and videos of several incidents. A Department of Public Safety spokesperson Tuesday said state troopers had, quote, strategically deflated tires. In other news from Minneapolis, the TV station Fox 9 is reporting federal and state prosecutors were negotiating a possible plea deal with former officer Derek Chauvin just days after he killed George Floyd. Floyd. The negotiations fell apart on May 28th. The following day, Chauvin was charged and arrested. A warning to our viewers, this next story contains graphic images of police violence. In Austin, Texas, Black Lives Matter activists are demanding the arrest of officers who sent 2 young people to the hospital with head trauma at recent protests. On May 31st, police shot 20-year-old Texas State University student Justin Howell in the head with a lead pellet bag fired by an officer's shotgun. After he fell unconscious to the pavement, he was picked up by fellow protesters who tried to rush him past a police line for medical attention. The police then opened fire with another barrage. Powell was hospitalized in critical condition with a fractured skull and brain damage. A day earlier, another Austin officer shot 16-year-old Brad Levy Ayala in the head with a beanbag round as the teen stood passively on a hillside near a line of riot police. Ayala's family says he's undergoing neurological testing at an Austin hospital and faces a long road to recovery. In San Jose, California, police shot their own anti-bias trainer in the groin, rupturing his testicle with a rubber-coated bullet as he tried to de-escalate tension between police and protesters at a May 29th rally. Doctors say 27-year-old Derek Sanderlin, who's African-American, may never be able to father children. And Los Angeles police officer Frank Hernandez was arrested Tuesday on felony assault charges. Video shot in April showed him brutally beating Richard Castillo, an unhoused man who'd been squatting in a Boyle House property amidst the coronavirus lockdown. And here in New York police officer Vincent D'Andrea has been charged with assault, criminal mischief, harassment, and menacing after video showed him violently shoving a peaceful protester to the ground as he shouted an expletive and a misogynistic slur at her. 20-year-old Dunya Zaire suffered a seizure and was hospitalized with concussion after the May 29th attack. President Trump has tweeted an attack on a longtime Buffalo police activist who was assaulted by police officers at a Black Lives Matter protest last week. In video of the assault, which has been viewed by millions, 2 Buffalo police officers are seen violently shoving 75-year-old Martin Gugino to the ground. Dozens of officers walk by as blood pours from Gugino's head. On Tuesday morning, as Gugino lay in a hospital recovering from head trauma, President Trump amplified a conspiracy theory pushed by right-wing news outlet One America News, tweeting, quote, "Buffalo protester shoved by police could be an Antifa provocateur. 75-year-old Martin Gugino was pushed away after appearing to scan police communications in order to black out the equipment. I watched. He fell harder than was pushed. Was aiming scanner, could be a setup," Trump tweeted. We'll speak with one of Martin Gugino's close friends and fellow activists later in the broadcast. In Russia, Moscow's mayor has eased coronavirus restrictions even as coronavirus cases continue to surge in the Russian capital. The easing of the lockdown comes ahead of a nationwide vote that could extend President Vladimir Putin's rule. Moscow continues to report over 1,000 new COVID-19 cases daily, while Russia as a whole is nearing 500,000 infections. Russia has reported over 6,300 coronavirus deaths. In Brazil, a Supreme Court judge Tuesday ordered the government of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro to immediately begin releasing updated coronavirus statistics just days after the country stopped publishing new reported COVID-19 deaths and infections. Brazil currently has the world's second highest rate of coronavirus cases, nearing 750,000, and has more daily deaths than any other country in the world. Officially, over 38,000 people in Brazil have died of COVID-19, though that number is likely a significant undercount. The World Health Organization has walked back a top official's claim that asymptomatic people rarely spread the coronavirus to others. The WHO's confused messaging on the topic drew criticism from public health officials. The Harvard Global Health Institute said, quote, "In fact, some evidence suggests people may be most infectious in the days before they become symptomatic. That is, in the pre-symptomatic phase when they feel well, have no symptoms, but may be shedding substantial amounts of virus," unquote. Meanwhile, 2 new papers published in the journal Nature find coronavirus lockdowns saved millions of lives and averted tens of millions of infections worldwide. UC Berkeley researcher Solomon Shang co-authored one of the reports.
Never in human history have so many people around the world come together, coordinated their actions, and worked to save so many lives in such a short period of time.
In Burundi, President Pierre Nkurunziza was pronounced dead Monday morning of an apparent heart attack. Many are speculating his death may have been due to COVID-19 complications after the long-serving president fell ill over the weekend. The president had refused to impose coronavirus restrictions, allowing sporting events and mass political rallies to take place during the pandemic. In environmental news, President Trump Friday gutted protections for the country's only maritime monument in the Atlantic Ocean by opening up the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument to commercial fishing. Gib Brogan from the advocacy group Oceana said, quote, "Protecting deep-sea waters is a win-win for both fishermen and healthy oceans, as healthy oceans from the sea floor to the surface will help sustain robust fisheries for years to come," he said. Legal challenges are expected. In climate news, temperatures in parts of the Arctic Circle in northern Russia have topped 86 degrees Fahrenheit this month, continuing a record-breaking heat wave that began in May. Climate data show last month was the planet's warmest May ever recorded, keeping 2020 on pace to become the hottest year since record-keeping began. The 10 hottest years on record have all come since 2005. And after 33 years, the reality TV show Cops has been canceled. In 2013, the group Color of Change launched a campaign to cancel the show, saying it, quote, built a profit model around distorted and dehumanizing portrayals of Black Americans in the criminal justice system. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, and the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York City, joined by my co-host Juan Gonzalez at his home in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and good day to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, after weeks of protests over the police killing of George Floyd, his family and friends gathered Tuesday in Houston, the city where he was raised, for a private funeral to lay him to rest and to call for change. This comes after a public viewing Monday when more than 6,000 people paid their respects. After the funeral, Floyd's golden coffin was driven to a cemetery to be buried beside his mother. Houstonians lined the streets as his motorcade passed. A horse-drawn carriage carried his coffin for the last mile of the procession. This is George Floyd's niece, Brooke Williams, speaking at the funeral.
Hello, my name is Brooke Williams, George Floyd's niece, and I can breathe. Long as I'm breathing, justice will be served for Perry. First off, I want to thank all of you for coming out to support George Perry Floyd. My uncle was a father, brother, uncle, and a cousin to many. Spiritually grounded and activist, he always moved people with his words. Their officer showed no remorse while watching my uncle's soul leave his body. He begged and pleaded many times just for you to get up, but you just pushed harder. Why must this system be corrupt and broken? Someone said, make America great again, but when has America ever been great? Those 4 officers were literally on him for 9 minutes, and none of them showed they have a heart or soul. This is not just murder, but a hate crime. I share happy memories with my uncle. Now that's all I have, are memories. I still can't pull myself together to how he is calling out my grandma a name. I believe my grandmother was right there with open arms saying, come home, baby, you shouldn't feel this pain. No one should feel this pain. Quote, Tupac, I'm sorry, y'all. Changes. You see, the old way wasn't working, so it's on us to do what we gotta do to survive. America, it is time for a change. Even if it shall begin with more protests, no justice, no peace.
That's George Floyd's niece, Brooke Williams. This is his brother, Philonise Floyd, who's set to testify before Congress today on police accountability.
wake up in the middle of the night thinking about my brother a lot because I couldn't believe it at first, but I see it now. All I think about is when he was yelling for mama. And I know how mama is. She's just right there. She got her hands wide open. Come here, baby. Every mama felt that. I want justice for my brother, my big brother. Everybody gonna remember him around the world. He's gonna change the world.
That's Philonise Floyd, George Floyd's brother. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden also spoke at the funeral in a recorded video after visiting Floyd's family on Monday. He began by addressing George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter, Gianna.
I know you have a lot of questions, honey. No child should have to ask questions that too many black children have had to ask for generations. Why? Why's Daddy gone? And looking through your eyes, we should also be asking ourselves why the answer is so often too cruel and painful. Why in this nation do too many black Americans wake up knowing that they could lose their life in the course of just living their life? Why does justice not roll like a river nor righteousness like a mighty stream? Why? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we can't turn away. We must not turn away. We cannot leave this moment thinking we can once again turn away from racism that stings at our very soul, from systemic abuse that still plagues American life.
During the funeral, Democratic Houston Congressmember Al Green called on lawmakers to support the Justice and Policing Act, introduced Monday by the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, which would make it illegal for law enforcement to put a foot on someone's neck. This is Congressman Green.
This country has not reconciled its differences with us. We survived slavery, but we didn't reconcile. We survived segregation, but we didn't reconcile. We're suffering invidious discrimination because we didn't reconcile. It's time for a Department of Reconciliation in the highest land, the highest office. It's time to have someone who's going to make it his or her business to seek reconciliation for black people in the United States of America every day of his life. That's what it is it's all about. It's time for us to reconcile. We need a Department of Reconciliation.
As mourners at George Floyd's funeral recalled how he made a difference, Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner used his address at the funeral to announce he would be signing a new executive order.
And what that order will say is that in this city, we will ban chokeholds and strangleholds. In this city, we will require de-escalation. In this city, you have to give a warning before you shoot. In this city, you have a duty to intervene. In this city, we will require comprehensive reporting. In this city, you must exhaust all alternatives before shooting.
That's Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner speaking Tuesday at George Floyd's funeral in Houston. When we come back, we look at the last 2 weeks of protest and the racist history of policing with scholar Khalil Gibran Muhammad. Stay with us.
In a little town, oh, just like a river I've been running ever since. Been a long time coming, but I know change will come. Oh, yes, it will. It's been too hard living, yeah, but I'm not afraid to die, because I know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. Now listen. Then I go to my brother.
Dre Tate singing Sam Cooke's Change is Gonna Come Tuesday at the funeral for George Floyd in Houston, Texas. Behind him, an artist paints a photo of George Floyd. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. It's been more than 2 weeks since the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis sparked a global uprising in defense of black lives. The protests seen in major cities, small towns across the U.S. show no sign of abating. As calls to defund the police grow, protesters are beginning to see results. Last weekend, the majority of Minneapolis City Council pledged to abolish the police department in Minneapolis. In New York, state lawmakers have voted to ban the use of chokeholds and repeal a law that shields the disciplinary records of police officers from the public. In Los Angeles, Mayor Eric Garcetti pledged to cut police funding by $150 million. Residents are now demanding he go much further. Well, for more on the significance of this moment in the history of policing in America, from slave patrols to the present day, we're joined by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, professor of history, race, and public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. He's the author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. Professor Muhammad, it's great to have you with us. If you could talk about this moment in time, both the uprisings, not only in this country but around the world, and also the history of policing that you so profoundly document.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Amy and Juan, for having me on the show. Listen, we haven't seen a moment like this in at least half a century, both here in the United States with protesters taking to the streets to demand once and for all not just police reform and accountability, but the prospect of a new vision of a relationship between state authorities and the health of a community. And the health of a community depends on everything from the public goods and social services that people need, but also safety. And safety can come in many forms. So as far as what we're seeing a moment that is akin to the challenge that rocked the world in 1968 with global movements for various forms of anti-capitalist and anti-imperial and anti-colonial organizing that took place both in the global south and in many of the metropoles of the global north. And, you know, it's hard to know for sure where we're going to go from this moment. But it's clear that when we look at the history of policing, we have run out of options in terms of reform, in terms of thinking about what the police can do for themselves. I liken this to asking the police agencies of this country to reform themselves is as ridiculous as asking the fossil fuel industry to solve our climate change crisis.
And Professor, in your book, you talk about the 400 years of legacy of the development of these methods of policing, going back to the slave patrols in the mid-19th century. I'm wondering if you could take our listeners and viewers through some of that history.
Absolutely. So, of course, people intuit and commonsensically understand that as a system of violent control over human beings, slavery required the use of violence to control people. And so for the entire period going back to the mid-1600s and to the early 1700s, colony after colony from New York and Massachusetts to South Carolina and Virginia passed a series of black codes or Negro Acts, various laws that were designed to empower everyday white citizens with the responsibility and, let me be clear, the duty to serve in an official capacity, to surveil, monitor, to track, and when caught, to dispense corporal punishment against enslaved African people in the colonies. It was the largest bureaucracy dedicated to a form of policing that we recognize today. And it was everywhere in the colonies. By the time the nation was born in 1790, while there were gradual abolition laws that took root in many northern colonies, the antebellum experience of free blacks was little different. What went from a slave patrol became the responsibility of a growing cohort of modern police officers. And this problem from slavery to freedom simply changed uniform and changed the instruments and tools of keeping track of people of African descent, and it expanded in the United States of America. But there's another part of this history that I think is really important, and that is that policing in the broadest sense was always about policing the essential workers of this society. And this is true in societies and countries all over the globe. And what do I mean by essential workers? Meaning the people who are at the bottom of the society, their freedom has always been constrained by more privileged and more elite, and in this country, whites. Now, whites, of course, range in class. And so one of the ironies is that both poor whites in many parts of the country were policed, especially when they challenged political authority, when they challenged economic inequality. But at the same time, they were able to join police forces. By the 1840s and 1850s, we see Irish Americans beginning to both make their way in America, but also begin to join the police force. They direct their sense of belonging in the United States for policing. Both a reflection of a racial and class hierarchy, and also a way of giving power to groups that feel like they don't have access to the top of the American economy. So policing is a reflection of a tremendous disorder in our economic system. It is a reflection of racial hierarchies that are deeply entrenched in our society. And when we see FOP or union leaders represented by working class white men, partly they have been empowered to define the profession as their own, not as a reflection of liberal democratic norms and universal ideas, but it is their profession. So for me, to talk about the history of policing is also to talk about the history of white supremacy and racial capitalism in the United States of America.
That I'm wondering, because this does not only affect, although it has largely affected the African American community, but it's also been, this method of using law enforcement and policing as a method of domination has also been used with other people of color, specifically Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans. In 1862, President Lincoln ordered the hanging of 38 Dakota warriors who had gone to war against the U.S. in the midst of the Civil War, and they were hanged as criminals and as murderers, not as enemy combatants. And I'm thinking of the Texas Rangers, who were largely created to control and dominate Mexicans who were called bandits because they were defending their land. And even with Puerto Ricans, from Albizu Campos to Oscar Lopez Rivera, all the freedom fighters were always branded as criminals and dealt with as criminals within the justice system. I'm wondering, this whole issue of the territorial expansion of the country necessitating even more police repression on these populations of color. Your sense of it in your historical studies.
Listen, Juan, I mean, the summaries and examples you just gave are incredibly important because to take it back to the very beginning, my colleague, Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who's written about the U.S. Border Patrol and its origins in policing the movement of Mexicans coming to the country because the country wanted them here to work. But she also describes that the infrastructure of American colonial settlement, the very basis upon which the country literally expanded, as you say, the territorial expansion, was the jail. And she goes back to the very beginning in the 1700s to what is now the city of Los Angeles, which used to be the Tonga Basin, which used to be populated by indigenous populations. And she said it was precisely the introduction of the physical jail as the instrument of control and domination, but a domination that was always rooted in harnessing the labor power of people, not to exterminate or to exclude them altogether, but to ensure that their labor would be extracted for the purposes of work, and then everything else would be controlled, that their freedom would be constrained. And that story is the story of every group in every part of the country whose labor power was the most important contribution that they would make. Their civil liberties, their civil rights, their human rights, their humanity itself was optional, was secondary. Their right to political dissent was secondary. So you could look at Chinese immigrants in San Francisco in the 1880s and see the same story. You can look in Chicago in the midst of the labor upheavals of the 1890s with foreign-born immigrant whites demanding fair treatment in the workplace, and see the same story. You can look at Texas and look and see the story of the Texas Rangers, which enforced literal white property theft of Tejano and Mexican descendant landowners, people who not only had once been part of Mexico before the Mexican Revolution and before the annexation of Mexico by the United States in 1848, but people who were law-abiding, respectable citizens in their communities. And white settlers showed up and essentially accused them of false crimes, criminalized them, and Texas Rangers enforced that. So across time, across space, and across groups, policing has a tortured history of being enforcers of various forms of domination.
And this is so interesting. Khalil, because you, before you were a Harvard professor, you were the head of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which was established by Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, who was an African-American Puerto Rican, bringing together all of these different cultures. I'm wondering if you now can go back, as you have, talking about the history of police repression, and talk about the history of the resistance to it.
Yeah, so the resistance is fascinating because for every slave patrol was a individual or group of individuals who sought to subvert the system. And of course, the most famous of those who fought against it was Harriet Tubman. And while often we think of her as a kind of caricature person who stands outside of history, she embodied the earliest forms of resistance to the system itself, but also to challenging the very violent instruments of that system. We can look at the resistance of laborers who armed themselves to fight against private security and police officers at the gates of companies in various cities of Massachusetts in the 1870s, in steel country, in the Midwest. In the rise up of populist, anti-capitalist organizing of socialist leaders in the turn of the 20th century, white workers and black workers, in some cases side by side, fought together to change the very understanding of their rights as economic beings and as citizens of this country. And most certainly we can look at northern cities as places where African Americans showed up beginning in World War I and completely transforming the understanding of work and citizenship in this nation by virtue of the Great Migration. And in time after time, instance after instance, African Americans demanded equality at the workplace, demanded equality in the homes, and they fought against white police and white citizens in that effort. We saw commissions beginning in really the 1890s around white police agencies focused on immigrants. And then we saw the same thing occur in the Great Migration period beginning in Chicago as a result of an anti-Black riot in 1919. These commissions came to the same conclusion over and over again. For over a century, from Chicago to the consent decree in Chicago in 2017 around the Laquan McDonald shooting, you have the arc of 100 years of history saying the same story, which is that some precipitating act of violence by a police officer is only the tip of the iceberg of a submerged story of hundreds, in some cases thousands of people being subject to various forms of everyday forms of abuse and trauma by the police. And that resistance in the form of those commissions is Black folks speaking to their condition. Of course, the Black Freedom Movement gave us the Black Panther Party and other radical groups that essentially centered police brutality as the key issue for securing Black dignity and citizenship in this country and other places. And they were subject to the full weight of the federal government in repressive tactics, including COINTELPRO and other mechanisms, including assassination, which in the most high-profile case killed Fred Hampton in 1969 in Chicago.
I want to turn to U.S. Attorney General William Barr, speaking Sunday on CBS Face the Nation, asked if he believes there's systemic racism in law enforcement. This is his response. It's not playing, but let me ask you this. Professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad, you've talked about the resistance through history. How does what we're seeing now, it looks like we have William Barr.
I think there's racism in the United States still, but I don't think that the law enforcement system is systemically racist. I understand the distrust, however, of the African American community given the history in this country. I think we have to recognize that for most of our history, our institutions were explicitly racist. Since the 1960s, I think we've been in a phase of reforming our institutions and making sure that they're in sync with our laws and aren't fighting a rearguard action to impose inequities.
I don't think that the law enforcement system is systematically racist. Professor Muhammad, your response?
Well, I mean, I was actually more impressed with some of the concessions he made in that speech than this fine line he draws between individual rotten apples and the system itself. I'd like your listeners and viewers to think about this way. This would be the akin of saying that Americans' prisons are not built to dehumanize, given everything we know what goes on inside of them, despite the fact that people who show up to work every day are not necessarily evil people. That's the problem we're having around this conversation around policing. Policing as a system has been a system of control that sorts people and decides who gets to live and who gets to die with even the mere accusation of criminality. That is not true in white, affluent communities. It is not true in communities where political elites are. We just saw a parade of criminality in the Trump administration, and all we kept hearing is federal prosecutors say, we're not sure we can win this case. We're not sure we can bring the case. We didn't see Michael Cohen be subjected to pepper spray or flash grenades or a knee on his neck. So there is a double standard of justice in America, that police are enforcing white supremacy and they're enforcing economic hierarchy. And until we come to terms with that in the way that we should be coming to terms with what happens inside of our prisons, we're going to continue to see the resistance take to the streets and demand justice and transformation.
And Khalil, I wanted to ask you about a particular aspect of the role of the press and the media narrative in the issues of policing and police abuse. For most of the country's history, and I've done quite a bit of studying of the history of the press in America, the press functioned almost as an intelligence operation for the dominant white community. During the colonial period, as much as a third of all of the content of American newspapers was intelligence to the white settlers about what the African American or the Native American communities were doing. But even up to the 60s, the press were largely white, and the rebellions of the 60s, they reported from a white perspective, as the Kerner Commission noted. But in recent years, as the press themselves have become diversified, we're seeing both in the mainstream medium and, of course, now with citizen videos, this enormous change in the narrative as to what the role of the police is. I'm wondering if you think that along with the public resistance movement will have a more lasting effect in terms of redirecting or changing the nature of policing in America?
Juan, it's a great question, and I certainly appreciate even your sharing your own research and brief history of media in the past. I think it's important. So if the question is, can we see this moment for the democratization of media itself, obviously by virtue of social media and the fact that citizens can aggregate and spread news in ways that they could not before, I do think this is a fundamentally different moment. The gatekeeping of information and distribution of knowledge has broken down in many ways, both for good and for bad. But on the good side of the ledger, there's no question that this is a moment of possibility because there is a crisis of legitimacy in our democratic institutions, most obviously in the executive branch with the White House. But it is also true that news agencies around the country, no matter who's in charge, a black person or a white person or a Latino or Asian American, have been deferential over the past to official accounts. And the crisis of legitimacy for police agencies has led many of those news directors, no matter who they are, to begin to think like, we can't trust the official record. In the case of Derek Chauvin's killing of George Floyd, he lied on the police record. So the deference that has been assumed up to this time now is breaking down. The ability to shoot in real time the killing and execution of people by police or the brutality directed by police, as this case in Buffalo and many other places as police use brutality to stop protesters from protesting against brutality, means that this crisis of legitimacy will be resolved. The only question of what the resolution looks like is how long will people stay in the streets demanding change?
Khalil Gibran Muhammad, finally defund the police. Do you see a comparable movement in history, and how this has changed the narrative?
The defund the police moment is an incredible adjustment to the issue of abolition that has mostly been about activists seeding the notion that these institutions are fundamentally broken. Organizations like Critical Resistance that Ruth Gilmore and Angela Davis began many decades ago have helped to develop the theory of change, of which abolition in our prison system and in our police have been developed. Defund takes the core idea of abolition and says, if we were to start over, what would we decide police should be doing versus not be doing? Now, I'm already picking a middle position between the notion that we simply wipe out police altogether, which is one abolitionist version of it, but defund, as it is being articulated in places like Minneapolis, is really a conversation of we're going to start over. And we're going to start over by putting together a list from everything from nuisance calls to wellness checks to claims of violent crime. And we're going to decide what the police ought to be doing. And once we see what's left over, then that's the percentage of the budget that the police, a new version of the police, will keep. The rest will go to other public services. We can use violence interrupters, who are public health workers trained in the community, by the community, for the community, to, in fact, deal with conflict resolution. This is how it works in nearly every other country where police have not been militarized and given unlimited resources and power to police their own citizens as if they were soldiers in occupied territory. People resolve conflicts inside of healthy, functioning communities. So people in this country need the same training and resources to be able to do similar things. That's what defund is about. I'll say one more thing about this, and that is that police unions are a problem. So those on the left cannot be ambivalent about the need for opening up collective bargaining agreements where police unions are concerned, because they are a major impediment to the reforms and the defund or whatever version of new policing is going to emerge out of this moment.
Khalil Gibran Muhammad, I want to thank you so much for being with us, Professor of History, Race and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, Suzanne Yang Murray, Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. When we come back, we look at the story of Martin Gugino, the 75-year-old Buffalo peace activist who's remaining hospitalized after being pushed to the ground by two Buffalo police officers. Now President Trump has attacked him on Twitter. Stay with us. Houston gospel singer Kim Burrell singing at George Floyd's funeral service in Houston Tuesday. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. On Tuesday, President Trump made no mention of George Floyd's funeral, nor did he send condolences to his family on the day that George Floyd was laid to rest. But he did take to Twitter to attack a longtime peace activist in Buffalo, where police officers assaulted him at a protest last week against the police killing of George Floyd. In the video recorded by a bystander that's now been viewed by millions of people, 2 police officers violently shoved 75-year-old Martin Gugino to the ground as dozens of officers walk by, not one stopping to help him, as blood seeps from his head on the pavement. After widespread outrage, the 2 officers were charged with felony assault over the weekend, prompting 57 police officers from Buffalo's emergency response team to quit the special unit in protest. Martin Gugino is well known in the Buffalo community for his years of peaceful protest, including as a member of Witness Against Torture, a group that's long advocated for the closure of Guantanamo Bay. In his many years as an activist, Gugino has demonstrated against climate inaction, racism, and nuclear proliferation. On Tuesday, while President Trump did not mention George Floyd, he attacked Martin Gugino as he lay in the hospital. Trump tweeted, quote, "Buffalo protester shoved by police could be an Antifa provocateur. 75-year-old Martin Gugino was pushed away after appearing to scan police communications in order to black out the equipment. I watched. He fell harder than was pushed. Was aiming scanner. Could be a setup," Trump tweeted. Trump tagged One America News, a fringe right-wing media outlet that frequently amplifies conspiracy theories and has run multiple segments attacking Gugino since video of his assault drew national ire. One Republican senator after another was asked to comment, while Mitt Romney did, saying it was ridiculous. Other senators said, we are weighing the information. For more, we're joined by someone who protested alongside Martin Gugino for over a decade. Lou Aya is a part of the Peace Poets, a member of Witness Against Torture. He's joining us from Oakland, California. Lou Aya, it's wonderful to have you with us. And if you can talk to us about Martin, talk about what his activism is all about, how you know him, and your response to President Trump's completely unfounded, outright lying tweet.
Thanks so much, Amy. Thanks, Juan. It's good to be with you both. Martin, first and foremost, is just one of the kindest, most good-hearted people that I've been lucky to walk with. And so this morning, as he's still in the hospital, I just want to send him love and healing from here. I was able to work with Martin with Witness Against Torture. Every January, we go there to protest the continued abuse of human rights in the prison in Guantanamo and demand justice for the people detained there. So working with Martin has always been a joy. It is great to be able to tell people that he's one of the amazing elders that has always led with curiosity, creativity, and courage in our community of Witness Against Torture. And so, to be honest, Amy, I appreciate your question, but it's hard to even justify a response to such a ridiculous tweet from President Trump. I feel personally that it's important to first just say that Martin is someone who deserves, like all our elders, much more respect and care. And so I want to notice what the president of the country did not say. He did not say that it's important for the police to respect elders, to treat people with dignity and care. And so that, to me, in the face of having seen what happened to this friend of mine, who was pushed over when I heard his head hit the pavement, I jumped towards the screen where I was watching it, just because so I could try to help him the same way that I feel like a lot of us respond to seeing these images of violence. And I just want to point out the absence of that, the absence of care and compassion for all our people, and especially for our elders. And so for Martin, again, someone who just always led with kindness, with love and respect, it's really painful to see that lack of care, and of course see the opposite, the criminalization of dissent and trying to create a narrative in which he is the enemy which is really painful because I know he was out there, and I want to raise up Martin's one response so far since the attack. And he was all he said was he wanted to be clear that his statement was Black Lives Matter.
And Lou, I wanted to ask you, like many of us, we keep being astounded when we think that this president has reached a new low, but he always manages to find an even deeper low to drop into. I wanted to ask you about some of the work that you did with Martin at Witness Against Torture. What were some of the activities you were involved in together, and what drove him to be involved?
Yeah. So the work that we would do is every January we go to D.C. for a week of fasting and action and prayer. So it's really an advocacy week in which we spend all day, every day together thinking about the ways in which we can creatively express our outrage at the continued injustices perpetrated by our government. And so our time together was really often spent in circles, deciding how are we going to best do a creative action, and then going out into the streets of D.C., to the Supreme Court, to the White House, to express to the government as well as to the people the need for human rights in Guantanamo and all military prisons, as well as prisons throughout this country.
I wanted to go to Martin in his own words. Martin Gugino recently submitted a video statement to a judge in Georgia presiding over the case of the Kings Bay Plowshares, the 7 peace activists who broke into a nuclear submarine base in 2018. Martin quoted from the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr.
It really starts with this quote of Martin Luther King that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. What he doesn't say there is that it doesn't bend itself. We have to bend it. We have to go out into the culture and act justly, act morally, do good, and little by little, it will bend. We'll bend the culture towards justice. And some of the times, the culture doesn't want to be bent. And so there'll be a conflict, and that's just part of it. And Martin Luther King knew very well the possibilities.
Again, after being assaulted by police, Martin Gugino, who you just heard, is laying in a hospital bed. He was brought in critical condition. I wanted to give you a chance to sing the song that you wrote, Lou, to share it with us now.
Thanks so much. This song, I really want to raise up that Martin did a lot to support that shifting of culture, and one of the ways is by supporting my crew, the Peace Poets. And unfortunately, this song is still so relevant, and I want to invite those.
We have less than a minute.
Thanks so much. I still hear my brother crying, I can't breathe. So now I'm in this struggle singing, I can't leave. We calling out the violence of these racist police. And we ain't gonna stop till our people are free. We ain't gonna stop till our people are free. And right now, across the country, I know that I could hear my people rising up singing this. Defund the police, give that money to community, till black people free. We are rising up in unity. Thank you for having me here, and I hope that people keep singing in these streets, because that's what all of our people out there doing. Love and respect to all our people rising up. Thank you for having me today.
Lou, I thank you so much for being with us. A member of the Peace Poets and member of Witness Against Torture. He protested alongside Martin Gugino for over a decade. That does it for our broadcast. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe.